So this week, the biggest thing on most people's minds was James Comey's testimony, because his testimony is something that many believe would give us evidence into whether or not Donald Trump did in fact try to obstruct justice when it comes to the investigation into Michael Flynn. Now, unfortunately for many liberals and Democrats, they got a little bit more than they bargained for, because this wasn't just a testimony where we discussed Donald Trump's potential attempt to obstruct justice, but we learned from James Comey that a very powerful individual on the left also tried to obstruct justice. So we'll get to that, but first, when it comes to whether or not Donald Trump tried to obstruct justice, this is what James Comey had to say.
You know of any case where a person has been charged for obstruction of justice, or for that matter, any other criminal offense, where they said or thought they hoped for an outcome?
I don't know well enough to answer. And the reason I keep saying his words is I took it as a direction.
Right.
I mean, this is the President of the United States with me alone saying, I hope this. I took it as this is what he wants me to do. Now, I didn't obey that, but that's the way I took it.
You may have taken it as a direction, but that's not what he said.
Correct. That's
he
why
he said, I hope.
Those are exact words, okay. Correct.
You don't know of anyone that's ever been charged for hoping something. Is that a fair statement?
I don't, as I sit here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So make no mistake about it, Trump didn't specifically tell Comey that the investigation would have to turn out in a certain way. So if you look at it from that angle, then sure, you can make the case that he didn't obstruct justice. But when you really put the conversation in context, I think it's reasonable to assume that, yeah, what he did was an attempt to influence James Comey. I mean, they were alone. He told him he really hopes that, the investigation goes one way or the other. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And that is a brazen attempt, in my opinion, to influence the outcome of an investigation. And certainly any reasonable person in James Comey's position would agree that, yeah, actually, if you tell me when we're alone that you hope it turns out a certain way, that's a direction. But ultimately, when it comes to the question as to whether or not Trump did in fact obstruct justice, I think that Comey's testimony can potentially justify arguments from Republicans and Democrats. So Republicans will argue that the extent of Trump's influence was him simply expressing hope about the outcome of Comey's investigation. But on the other hand, Democrats will claim that simply discussing the investigation with James Comey in the first place was unethical. And the fact that Comey seemed to think that Trump was issuing him a directive, I think that's grounds for us to believe that Trump did try to influence the outcome of the investigation and obstruct justice. But again, when you put the conversation that they had in context, well, it really does seem as though Donald Trump was trying to influence James Comey in one way or the other. And if he's trying to influence James Comey, then yes, that is an obstruction of justice. And I do find that argument more persuasive. Now, as New York Daily News argues, the import of former FBI Director James Comey's statement released in advance of his Senate testimony, when considered with all of the surrounding evidence, is clear. Our president is guilty of obstruction of justice for endeavoring to obstruct an FBI investigation. Comey's advanced statement reveals that on February 14th, he was in a meeting with President Trump, Vice President Pence, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and others. At the conclusion of the meeting, the president asked everyone to leave except for Comey, with no one else present. President Trump asked Comey to drop the FBI investigation into former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Specifically, the president said Flynn hadn't done anything wrong on his calls with the Russians, but had misled the vice president, and said, I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy. I hope you can let this go. Yeah, to me, that just sounds incredibly damaging to Donald Trump. So the thing about this is, if we really do conclude that Donald Trump did try to obstruct justice and Democrats proceed with impeachment proceedings, then Democrats shouldn't just automatically rejoice, because then we'd be stuck with Mike Pence, who's exponentially more dangerous than Donald Trump. So, I mean, there's really no way for the American people to win here. So, yeah, I think that it's reasonable for us to believe, or certainly you can make the case, that Donald Trump did in fact obstruct justice. That's how I would see it if I was in Comey's position. And I think that that's how reasonable, objective people would agree with the situation. However, we'll see how consistent people are when it comes to obstruction of justice. Because apparently during the same testimony, James Comey made it very clear that someone on the left, Attorney General Loretta Lynch, also may be guilty of obstructing justice. Here's what he had to say about that.
Was your decision influenced by the Attorney General's tarmac meeting with the former President Bill Clinton?
Yes, in a ultimately conclusive way. That was the thing that capped it for me, that I had to do something separately to protect the credibility of the investigation, which meant both the FBI and the Justice Department.
Were there other things that contributed to that you can describe in an open session?
There were other things that contributed to that. One significant item I know the committee's been briefed on. There's been some public accounts of it, which are nonsense, but I understand the committee's been briefed on the classified facts. Probably the only other consideration that I guess I can talk about in an open setting is that at one point the Attorney General had directed me not to call it an investigation, but instead to call it a matter, which confused me and concerned me. But that was one of the bricks in the load that led me to conclude I have to step away from the department if we're to close this case credibly.
Yikes. Now, during the hearing, he also went on to talk about how, quote, Loretta Lynch had the appearance of a conflict of interest. So, not only did we find out that Donald Trump probably tried to obstruct justice, but that Loretta Lynch also probably tried to obstruct justice as well. Now, you can tell who the hypocrites are and who the hypocrites aren't by looking at both of these instances of potential obstructions of justice and seeing whether or not you find both of them persuasive. Because for me, I think that James Comey's testimony is evidence that both Loretta Lynch and Donald Trump obstructed justice, or certainly tried to. But if you're on the left and you think that Donald Trump obstructed justice but Loretta Lynch didn't, you're a hypocrite. And if you're on the right but you think that Loretta Lynch obstructed justice but Donald Trump didn't, again, you're a hypocrite. So we'll find out who the true hypocrites are and who the people that can actually be objective are. I think that this is damaging to both Loretta Lynch, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. And what this story really tells us, the main takeaway, in my opinion, is that elites on both sides of the political spectrum, the rich and the powerful, are clearly using their influence to try to persuade the FBI director to conclude investigations in one way or the other. And that's incredibly problematic. And look, I'm not going to pretend as though I can predict the outcome as to whether or not this will lead to Donald Trump's impeachment, because I just don't know. But we do know that there's certainly a case to be made that Donald Trump and Loretta Lynch both tried to obstruct justice and influence James Comey's investigation. And I'm not a big fan of James Comey, but I mean, what he says here, it's incredibly incriminating. I think it's very, very problematic. So look, if you're consistent, you would see both of these acts and both individuals who tried to influence James Comey as an obstruction of justice, at least potentially. But if you think one is an obstruction and the other isn't, then you really need to reevaluate your position, because I think it's an untenable position. I think that both of these are very similar instances of potential obstructions of justice. So, Democrats overall, they got more than they bargained for. They thought that they would have James Comey testify and incriminate Trump, but in the end, he may have incriminated Trump and Loretta Lynch. So, whatever's going to happen is going to happen, but I think that so long as we hold elites accountable, hold plutocrats and the oligarchy accountable, and let them know that they are not allowed to do this, then I'm okay with the outcome. Because could you imagine what would happen if a peasant like me or you tried to persuade James Comey to conclude one thing or the other, when it comes to his investigation? Oh, we'd be locked up immediately. But if you're wealthy, you get a free pass. So this whole testimony is incredibly angering to me, because it just shows that we have a two-tier justice system where the elites use their influence to get away with doing things that are just unacceptable and committing felonies, while the poor, we're penalized for it. So, yeah, there's something to be, there's a case to be made here.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.